Okay, so let's talk about DTT and what exactly makes up DTT, because there are 5 to 6 parts that we can really break down and analyze to help your teaching procedure through this. Okay, so let's start off with our discrete trial. There is first, should be a word that you're familiar with, antecedent. Okay, so as we know, an antecedent is the first part of something. It happens right before, right? Then we've got, secondly, the prompt, okay, or the instruction, the direction given. Number 3, the response. What is it? What's the behavior, that terminal skill that we're looking for our individual to exhibit, okay? Or what are we looking for them to learn? Okay, this should look very similar to our ABCs that we talked about before, right? Okay. But we're missing that C part, because technically this would be our antecedent. This would be our response or behavior. And then number 4 is the consequence. And as we discussed, our consequence isn't always a negative thing, right? We've got a consequence for a correct response, and then we also have a consequence for an incorrect response. So we could actually write that in 2 parts. For a minus, consequence for a plus. So it's going to be 1 or the 2 here. Consequence for positive, correct responding, or a consequence for incorrect response. And then last but not least, what we call an intertrial interval. Okay, or the brief pause that comes after the last prompt that you got and their response before you ask it again, or you ask a different question or provide a different instruction or prompt for another program. Okay? All right, so those are the 6 crucial steps. Let's briefly look at one of our program sheets for that. Okay? We're going to take, for example, our matching picture to objects program again. So let's look at this briefly for the information that we need. Okay, we've got our objective here. So when given a picture and an array of objects as choices, and teacher says match, student will match picture to its corresponding object. Okay, this is further defined our teaching procedure here. And in here, it'll give you the prompt. So I'll read it to you. It says, place a picture directly in front of the student in an array with corresponding object approximately 12 to 24 inches from student as you say match. Matches our prompt, okay? Remember the antecedent, these are the things that come right before, okay? And our prompt, that would be us giving that direction, match. Then the response, what are we looking for this learner to do? Student will match the picture to its corresponding object. And specifically it says, as you say match, wait 5 seconds for a response. So there's that response measure. And then if the student moves the picture so that it makes contact with with the corresponding object, praise and provide reinforcer. That's our positive response consequence, right? But if student does not move picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, say match, so that's reprompt, say match while modeling the matching movement. So you're actually modeling the appropriate response or what it was you were looking for. Then if student moves the picture so it makes contact with the corresponding object, praise and provide reinforcer. If student does not match the picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, say match again, and use physical guidance to help the student move the picture to the corresponding object. Okay, and then it gives you directions on how to code their responding. So that negative consequence or that error correction procedure of reprompting and then providing manual guidance. Remember we talked before about our prompting level, so this was pretty specific. It said full manual guidance just to help the student follow through there was provided. Okay? All right. So let's break this down a little bit and talk about each of these more specifically. So antecedent. The antecedent is the first part of our discrete trial, and it sets up the response in our original example. The antecedent was the teacher saying point to red, as well as the colored cards. So without this antecedent, Jane would not have been able to provide the correct response of pointing to the red card, and this is why the antecedent sets up the response, okay? So note that both the colored cards and the teacher's statement requests are needed for Jane to be able to answer correctly. So both are defined under the antecedent. So when writing out the discrete trial, all of the teacher's actions would be written out as the antecedent, with the antecedent abbreviated into just the letter A, right? As we talked about it before from our A, B's, and C's. Using the red-blue color discrimination task, the antecedent might be written as, I could say, A, let me use a different color, A, red, and blue. Actually, we will antecedent could be written out as red, red and blue, card on desk, in front of Jane. Teacher says, well, actually we'll say that for our prompt, okay? So red and blue card on front of desk in front of Jane. So antecedent is basically all the things you need in prep for your program. I would actually include in here as well the reinforcers that you're going to deliver, right? So that as soon as she makes a correct response, if your reinforcer isn't just verbal praise, that you've got your token economy there ready to deliver a token. Or maybe if it's a 1-to-1 reinforcement ratio, so every correct response, they get a primary reinforcer. So as soon as they do that, you give them tickles, or maybe you give them a small edible, all right? So I would have everything that you need to run the program right here as number 1. Okay, so prompts. Immediately after the antecedent, immediately after we get everything together, ready, out in front of us that we need to be able to work with our learner and have a successful session, we then need to provide a prompt or a direction to our learner, right? Okay. So prompts are supplemental teaching aids, and there are numerous types that can be used. To give an example, when Jane was first learning to point to the colored cards, a prompt called full gestural prompt might be used. For a full gestural prompt, after the teacher says point to red, she would then immediately point to the red card herself. effectively giving Jane the answer. Only if Jane then responded correctly by pointing to the red card would reinforcement be delivered. Okay? You guys are a little familiar already with our prompting hierarchy that we have. Okay? So as we talk about full prompt versus partial prompt versus independent responding, you should have an idea of what these terms are. If they're not familiar, you can go back in our session and review those areas now. Okay. So after this prompt has been used a number of times and Jane is responding correctly at a certain frequency or a set criteria, right, it might then be faded out to a partial gesture prompt. Remember, this should be terminology that you're hearing again. This time, after the teacher says point to red, she would only gesture about halfway to the red card, right, that partial gesture, or she might just do a partial touch like, hey, a little tap on the arm, and again, reinforcement would be delivered. If Jane progressed, this prompt might also be faded out so that no prompting was there at all, and the expectation would be that she did it independently, all right? When no prompt is used, the prompt level is still defined so it is clear to the teacher. No prompting is defined as independent or sometimes shortened with an I or IND, all right? So let's see our prompt level. We'll get to right number 2. And let's talk about our full gestural trials. So with a full gestural trial, a teacher places one red and one blue card on the table, then says point to red. The teacher then immediately points to the red card, full gestural prompt. Jane responds by pointing to the red card when the teacher would say, that's right, great job, okay? There would be a very short pause before a new discrete trial would begin. So that's a full gestural trial, okay? That's what our prompt starts with, is FG or full gesture. All right, now let's talk about partial gestural trials. During a partial gestural trial, a teacher places out still one red card and one blue card, right? That's our antecedent. And then says point to red. That would be our prompt. Okay, so let's just write here, prompt. Sometimes it might be blue, so we'll leave this blank, point to, and then you insert that stimuli that you're testing, whether it's blue or red. Okay? So going back to our partial gestural, the teacher immediately gestures halfway through across the table, then says point to red. Okay? So that's the key, that's the difference, right? So with our full gestural prompt, our teacher set everything up, set up the blue and the red card on the desk in front of Jane if she needed extra reinforcers, maybe a token economy or a primary one-to-one reinforcer there available for her. Then they provided that full gesture and then the prompt. Point to red or touch red. Okay, whereas now partial gestural, she just maybe pointed right from here, point to red or touch red, or gave her a tap behind the arm. Okay, and then the expectation is that she still responds by touching that red card, and then the teacher would say, you're right, great job, and provide reinforcement. Okay, now going on to independent trials. The teacher places, again, antecedent, one red and one blue card out on the table and says, point to red. That's the prompt. Because there is no additional prompt here. There is no pointing partially, no little touch, or no full point or full guiding them to touch it immediately, okay? There is absolutely no additional help. The expectation is this: you give the learner the direction, that initial prompt, with no other supports, okay? And you expect them to do it independently. So again, at an independent level, No additional prompting. You just give the initial prompt, the direction, touch red, and then the learner responds by touching the red card. And then you provide verbal reinforcement. That's right, awesome job, right? And then deliver reinforcement, additional reinforcement if necessary. Okay, good. So that's our prompting. All right, so responding. Number 3, response, responding. The response, sometimes called the target behavior or behavior, comes after both the antecedent and the prompt. When the discrete trial procedure is written out, the behavior is defined clearly with such technological terminology, right? I'm sure you've heard that word before. We were just talking about that earlier. Or also called an operational definition, right? That is defined clearly, such as Jane will point to the correct colored card, and not something more general such as Jane will answer correctly. Because what exactly does that mean, Jane will answer correctly? You need to know so that you implement the program the correct way. You ensure that you're only reinforcing the response as written, as well as anybody else that picks up the program, that they're doing the same procedure, that there's procedural integrity in what you're doing, okay? So here for number 3, we would say that Jane will point to the correct colored card. The clear definition ensures that anyone teaching the child will know precisely what response is to be reinforced, right? The behavior is abbreviated into, or sometimes it's abbreviated into R, or behavior is that B part, right, of the ABCs. So Jane will point to the correct colored card. Depending on the program that you're running, this might even be further defined, okay? So that, for example, if it's a point, you know that the individual just doesn't point from here, but maybe the object of the program is for them to touch something, okay? Maybe you want to teach a child because they have overgeneralized getting an item. So you sit down, you do DTI, you say, show me the ball, or where's the ball, and they pick up the ball, right? But that's not the intent, because later on, that gets in the way of doing other things and running other programs, because they're always in the nature of getting the item that you're asking them to find. Whereas just pointing to it is much more beneficial and lucrative to your programming and reaching these skills, mastering them. So sometimes you might actually write in something like, Jane briefly touches the item for 1 or 2 seconds and then goes back to a neutral position. All right, so that literally it is just a touch and then release. It's not a, and you hold your hand on the item, or it's not a pointing from over here. It's literally just a brief touch and let's go. Okay, so depending on the program, this might be even more precise and definitive in its writing. All right, great. So, prompt, or the response. In here in this program that we were talking about with pictures to objects, it actually gives you a response within the different prompt levels. So you wait 5 seconds for a response. If student moves picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, praise and provide reinforcement. So it's telling you right there exactly what the objective is, what that response, what the behavior is that they're looking for. The student moves the picture and makes contact with the object. That's the response, okay? So it's written in here, but also a lot of the times you'll be able to figure out exactly what the response is, or the objective, or the behavior that's intended to be taught up above. When given a picture and an array of objects as choices and a teacher says match, student will match picture to its corresponding object. This was a little vague. This was more descriptive in here because it further defined exactly what matching is. Okay, because this just says matching picture to its corresponding object, but down here it says it actually moves the picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object. So make sure that you read through the teaching procedure in order to really understand what response is qualified as a correct response or an incorrect response. Okay, so that brings us to our next piece. Okay, so we have consequences for correct responses or incorrect responses, right? So we've got our things that are completely laid out on the table, our things that go into setting up and prep. Then we deliver our prompt or direction. Then we have our response from the learner, and then we need to respond somehow depending on whether it was a correct or incorrect response with a different response. Okay? So, correct responses receive positive reinforcement, which may be in the form of verbal praise and or through a token economy or delivery of some sort of tangible primary reinforcer like a sweet. Okay? The type of and amount of reinforcement must also be defined and adhered to, as it can be an integral part of the success of the educational program. Again, so that'll probably go into your antecedent piece here. You already have those things set up because you know what your learner has as part of their programming and as part of their reward system to encourage motivation to engage in these materials. Remember, we talked about establishing operations, so that's a big part of that. For the sake of this training, we'll say that reinforcement will be delivered after every single correct response. So every time Jane points to the correct colored card, positive reinforcement through tokens is immediately delivered, okay? So giving reinforcement after every correct response is called a continuous schedule of reinforcement, or it could also be defined as a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, with the one denoting how many correct responses are necessary to provide reinforcement. So for example, and I think we touched upon this in our reinforcement area, but we'll follow through with a little bit more now. If I was going to make sure that our learner got reinforcement for every single correct response, that would be a 1-to-1 ratio. If I wanted to say, and remember that's continuous reinforcement, right? But if I did a fixed ratio, which is FR, a fixed ratio could also be something like 1-to-2, okay? So for every 2 correct responses, they get a token or an edible. Or it could be anything like 1 token or edible for every 5, or 1 for every 10, okay? It depends on the ability for your learner to wait or have delayed reinforcement, okay? Remember, one of those keys to reinforcement and consequences is immediacy, right? And the more novel a program, and also for some children that just may need a higher level of reinforcement, the more dense of a schedule that needs to be, okay? Whereas if they've gotten in the habit of doing a program for a while, you might be able to thin out that reinforcement, okay? Or maybe they've completed quite a bit of it and you can start to withdraw. So that's where you get your fixed ratio. You can also do something called a variable ratio. So a variable ratio means that around every so many responses you deliver reinforcement, okay? So a variable ratio could still be around maybe every 1 to 5. So not always 5, maybe on the 4th time you give them a reward, or on the 6th or 7th time you give them a reward, but on average it's around that 5th. Or you could do the same again, that 1 to 10. So around every 10th time. Maybe sometimes it's the 8th time they get something correct, or maybe the 13th time that they get something correct, but on average it's around that 1 to 10. Research shows that variable reinforcement is actually more productive and motivating over time than fixed ratio. I want you to think of the example of someone gambling, okay? You're at the casino. You get a payout on a fixed schedule. Every 5 times, I know that this machine is going to pay out, okay? So either A, you're going to be that person that walks around the casino looking at all of the machines to see if it's on the 4th time, because that 5th time you're going to be on it to get that payout, right? Or you're going to sit on a machine and hold it down and just keep playing, keep playing, keep playing, until all of a sudden it stops paying out on the 5th time. You might play it a few more times, but then when it doesn't on that 5th time, you're going to be like, oh my God, this thing's broken. I'm moving on to something else, right? Whereas, if you had a variable ratio, like they currently employ at casinos, where it keeps you guessing, you're going to be more likely to keep playing, because you never know when it will not pay out. It's the same idea with programming and getting students to engage and motivate them in learning. They're not 100% sure. They can't count on exactly when you're going to provide them with reinforcement, so they're more likely to maintain their momentum over time. All right? So that's why variable schedules are always more preferred when we're working with students. Okay? Other types of schedules of reinforcement, we have interval reinforcement. So the same thing though, instead of ratio, we would have fixed interval, FI, and variable interval. So now this isn't the number of responses, okay, but this is the amount of time that goes by. So around every, we could say 1 to every 5 minutes, okay, or 1 to every 30 seconds. And this will go over a little bit more when we get to our interval data collection sheets and our duration data collection sheets. But this really is more for behavioral responding, increasing and decreasing behavior, because every 5 minutes that goes by, as soon as it's 1 second over that 5 minute, you provide reinforcement contingent on what the behavior is that we're looking for, okay? Or maybe it's 30 seconds, right? But you could also write this as, there's quite a few different ways that we'll get into this in further detail in future trainings, but just so you get an idea of that there is also interval reinforcement that goes on, okay? And variable interval, again, it's the same thing, but it's like around that 5 minute mark, or around that 30-second mark, okay? So you could say maybe like around every 30 seconds that my individual isn't engaged in aggressive behavior, I provide a token, maintaining their positive behavioral momentum over time, okay? But as soon as they engage in negative behavior, then you delay providing reinforcement. Okay. So let's come back up here to our consequences, positive or negative. All right. So where were we? I'm trying to think here. Let's do the number 4. We've got our positive consequence plus or consequence minus. So correct response, exactly what our consequence would be, and an incorrect response, exactly what our consequence would be. So we talked a little bit about correct responding for, or what we would do for correct responding, right? Giving reinforcement on either a continuous schedule or an intermittent schedule that we have down here. So we could say continuous or intermittent. We'll say for our purposes here, it's going to be continuous for Jane. So in a one-to-one schedule. So every correct response, she gets a token, okay? And so we'll have to add up here tokens to our antecedent, okay? If she gets an incorrect response on here, we have to follow through with an error correction procedure. So let's talk about incorrect responding. So an error correction procedure, there used to be a train of thought where we would respond with a teacher providing a no, looking away, removing teaching materials, and that being the signal that that was an incorrect response. But research showed that this actually isn't best practice, and this really isn't achieving anything, because you're dealing with individuals that have unusual motivation, and for them to see you do that no had absolutely no effect on them at all, and it was just a waste of time, and if anything, probably confusing for them about your verbal expression. Like, is that a direction, or are you like giving me a consequence? I don't understand, right? So instead, a correction procedure would be followed by the teacher to show the child what the correct response was, okay? Or what our error correction procedure is. This correction would use a pre-chosen prompt to guide the child and help them understand what the correct response was. When written out, the correction is generally abbreviated with a CORR in apostrophes, or a C2 if there's a second level to the error correction procedure. As an example, if the teacher said point to red, but Jane pointed to the blue card, the teacher might then point a full gestural prompt, right, to the red card saying red. Then the teacher would then give a neutral statement and say, let's try another one, or let's do it again. For incorrect responses, no reinforcement is given, and any words that you give to tell them if they did or didn't do something is generally just neutral, okay? You're not over the top, like, good job! Instead, it's just, nope, this is the red one, okay? And then you move forward. One thing to note, though, when I typically do an error correction procedure, I'll put in something that you provide the prompt again, and then you follow through immediately with doing the error correction procedure, showing them the correct response, and then neutrally saying something like, that's the blue card, good. And then switching up with another program, maybe you ask them to do a compliance that you already know is in their repertoire, so that you can give them some sort of verbal praise, like, yeah, that's clapping your hands, good job, right? You're maintaining that behavioral momentum, and then you might be able to ask them the question again, or move on to a different program. But for our case here, we would do continuous reinforcement for a positive for a positive consequence, and then for negative, we're going to say error correction procedure. Okay, so let's look back in our example here from match pictures to objects. So if we read through this, it tells you exactly what our error correction procedure should be for the negative response. So if student does not move picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, say match, that would be your reprompt, while modeling the matching movement. Wait 5 seconds for a response. If student moves the picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, praise and provide reinforcer. If student does not move picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object. Say match again. So this would be your error correction number 2, C2. You reprompt it a second time, match, and use physical guidance to help student move the picture to the corresponding object. Okay, and then it tells you exactly how you should score that. So that goes into our prompting hierarchy again, right? How many prompts are you going to give? And that should be delineated in your program sheet, okay? So if the first prompt is a partial gestural prompt, okay, that would be your CORR with a P. So we would have number 1, CORR, partial prompt, right? And then number 2, or C2, would be full manual guidance. So you're fully guiding them to make the correct response. All right? So that is our error correction procedure. The idea behind this is that, for example, if you had out the red and the blue card and you said touch blue and the individual touched red, and in response you guided them and you said that's blue, but you didn't reprompt at all, meaning you didn't re-say touch blue and then go through this like a light prompt or partially gesturing to letting them do it on their own, okay? You're not restarting the program. Instead, you could actually accidentally chain an unwanted behavior. Remember we talked about chaining before? How you put one behavior together with another and then you provide reinforcement? Because over time, if you let that kiddo accidentally touch, after you say the initial prompt, point to blue or touch blue, and each time you let them touch red and then you guide them to touch blue and then you say that's touching blue, over multiple times they could actually chain those two things so that they think that the response to the direction touch blue is touching red and touching blue, because that's the behavior chain that they've gotten reinforced for. So unless you break that chain completely and you reprompt each time with touch blue, and then you guide them to touch blue or do that partial guidance, whatever your prompt level is, that's the only way that they're going to figure out that touching blue is the only response that gets reinforcement when you provide the direction touch blue. Okay, so I hope that makes sense as to why we use our error correction procedure here. All right, so that wraps up consequences, and now we'll move on. Okay, so last but not least, we have our intertrial interval. Okay, so usually there's a little here. Okay. So the intertrial interval comes after the consequence, whether correct or incorrect. As the name suggests, it's an interval that comes between trials and signifies the ending of a trial. It is not written out into the discrete trial script, as it is something that will always happen and does not need to be defined unless there's a specific time interval that needs to be followed for a certain program. That might be something that's more like behavioral if you're doing some sort of partial interval, whole interval, okay, but we can get into a little bit more of that later. So research shows that intertrial interval should be as short as humanly possible, just a few seconds at most, okay? And that's in an effort to mimic natural talking styles, natural direction giving, multitasking that typically occurs in the regular environment, okay? It's not going to happen every day that someone says, touch blue. Good, that's touching blue. And then you wait a few minutes, and then you say, okay, are you ready? All right, let's do the next one. What letter? Good. Nice job, that is A. Okay. Right? We don't talk that way. Responding doesn't come that way. It's fast. So a lot of the time, it's going to be quick. Okay? And the more that you can actually intersperse trials, which is something that we'll talk about in a little while, and really make it fairly natural, and that you're bringing in a variety of programs and you're doing it quickly, is going to make our learner better adept at generalizing these skills to the typical environment. So for example, I might say, you know, touch blue. Good, that's blue. What letter? A. Awesome job, that is A. Touch your nose. Good job, that's touching your nose. What am I? Sad. That's right, I am sad. What's your name? Tell your name. Good job, that is your name. How old are you? Right, you are that old. Can you clap your hands? Right, so you're just switching it up. You are interspersing trials. You're really making it pretty random and you're making it fast, okay? Because that's almost how fast a learner would have to respond to a typical learner in the environment, which is basically our ultimate goal. Okay, so inter-trial and interval, this is really going to be up to you and according to best practice. So this is going to be completely contingent on the learner that you're working with. Some might need a little bit more of a pause. Some might need it super fast. Some you might need to do that mass trial format where you drill 5 to 10 trials all one after the other because they need that amount of dense learning to be able to retain information. Whereas others are going to be completely bored stiff and rolling around on the floor by the time you get to the 4th time asking them touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, right? So this is going to be very dependent on the learner that you're working with, and you're going to have to use your own skills, or realistically, you know, what you should be doing is talking with the person that put together the program for this individual or the teacher and asking them exactly what their intention for the program is and what they would recommend. Okay, great. So this about wraps up this piece. Please look at the online materials to find further information on where you can locate these within your program sheet.